Super 3 and the Shadow of Shame, written by Garth Newman and Yumna Saran. Layla, Timber and George loved being at school. They enjoyed playing together and wearing their super cool new face masks. They did their best to protect themselves from the scary, invisible monster called coronavirus. Layla's new face mask had cat paws. Timber's had flames, and George's was covered in lightning bolts. One day, Layla didn't turn up for school. Timber sent her text messages, and George tried to call her. But there was no reply. After a few days, they both started to get worried. Eventually, their teacher told them that Layla had a cold and that she needed to take some time off from school to get better. 2 weeks later, Layla returned. Timber and George were very excited. They couldn't wait to get back to playing their favorite game. Super 3! Yay! But Layla didn't seem very happy to see them. In fact, she didn't want to play with them at all. Timber and George noticed a shadow of shame following her around. Layla hid inside the classroom during breaks. She hardly spoke, and she didn't even want to play superheroes anymore. The shadow of shame seemed to follow Layla wherever she went. Whenever Timber and George tried to speak to her, she turned away, and the shadow grew even longer. Eventually, the shadow of shame grew so long and dark that it seemed to cover Layla entirely. Wherever she went, she felt as though everyone was staring at her. With droopy shoulders and her head hanging low, Layla looked troubled. Timber and George were very concerned. They decided that they needed to have an urgent meeting with Layla. They wanted to know why the shadow of shame was always there. After a lot of convincing, she decided to talk to her friends about what she had been going through. Layla eventually told them that the cold she had wasn't an ordinary cold. Even though she had worn her mask, washed her hands regularly, and kept her distance from others, somehow the invisible corona droplets still managed to get to her. Layla burst into tears as she spoke. She felt as if she had let her best friends down by not doing a super enough job of keeping the coronavirus at bay. She felt embarrassed. Layla thought that no one would ever want to play with her again. She imagined that everyone would believe that she caught the coronavirus because she was careless. She was terribly ashamed, and that's why the shadow of shame followed her around. She felt that it was best to stay far away from her two best friends. As Layla told her story, Timber thought about his uncle who had the coronavirus, and George thought about his cousin who had caught it too. These people who they cared about were probably just as troubled by a shadow of shame and feeling just like Layla. Timber and George told Layla that she had nothing to feel ashamed about. They were just happy that she was healthy. As they started playing together again, the shadow of shame grew smaller and smaller until it eventually disappeared. But the friends were still concerned about others who had caught the coronavirus and had a shadow of shame following them around. Layla, Timber, and George asked themselves, what would our superheroes do? Suddenly, the Super 3 had some amazing realizations. The three friends knew that it was unfair for people who had caught the coronavirus to be treated differently. As the Super 3, it was their duty to help others get rid of their shadows of shame. Someone like Layla, who caught the coronavirus, should not be ashamed. In fact, staying home and not spreading the virus was the most heroic thing to do. Their super secret weapon against the shadow of shame was kindness, love, and understanding. Layla, Timber, and George continued wearing their super cool face masks, washing their hands, and playing together. but staying 2 meters apart. They felt super, knowing that the best way to conquer the shadow of shame was to shine their light of kindness and acceptance into the world. The end.